Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back for another episode of the Beautifully Broken podcast with Martha Carlin. How you doing this morning?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
We both have our cup of joe, I assume. Are you drinking anything special this morning in there?
I am actually having a milk thistle and hibiscus tea mixture.
Oh, incredible. Incredible. I'm trying this Life Boost coffee, which I absolutely love. It's a very clean coffee bean.
Mm.
1 cup a day, and she's doing me right now.
Well, that's good. I did have a cup of coffee earlier, but easing into tea for the rest of the day.
Martha, I'm so excited to start the conversation today. I heard on one of your interviews that you are deemed the poop queen.
Yes, I am. I have spent a decade kind of combing through the poop.
It's a perfect conversation starter for this morning. What got you interested in the microbiome and fecal matter?
Well, it actually goes all the way back to 2002 when my 44-year-old husband, who was what I thought healthy, vigorous, marathon running person, was diagnosed with Parkinson's. And I was like, how does a young person get an old person's disease? And so that at the time I was working, I had a background in accounting and auditing, so was taught to never take anything at face value and always examine the evidence for yourself. And so I started looking at this disease that was, kind of thrown at us, saying, there's nothing you can really do. Here's a pill, it's progressive. And I thought, well, there's got to be something you can do. And so I started trying to understand what are the factors that are contributing to Parkinson's, and just digging into the science of food and environmental things. And, fast forward 12 years later, in the process of that search, I read a book called Missing Microbes from Martin Blaser, and it mentioned the microbiome. And I was like, what's this? And so I'm reading it. And to me, with an accounting background, it's like, oh, that's kind of like the general ledger of your body that keeps track of, what you've been exposed to and what's in and out. And then later that year, the first paper was published that showed you could divide the two different types of Parkinson's by the bacteria in the gut. And I was like, eureka, that is it. And I quit my job. I started funding some research at the University of Chicago, doing a time series sampling of poop of my husband and me over a 6-month period. And, that was my first kind of digging into poop, looking at the data. And it was very early in that field. And I met, through that process, Dr. Jack Gilbert, who was at the University of Chicago. And he had a son who was autistic, and we were looking at these microbiome samples. And there was some overlap in Parkinson's and autism. And so through this process, I met another scientist, Dr. Suzanne Vernon, who was studying chronic fatigue for about 20 years. And there was some overlap there. And we're like, what's holding back our ability to really find the answers? And Suzanne had worked at the CDC, and she said, well, you really need a quality sample bank, because a lot of times people do these collections, they don't collect the samples well, you have to throw them out, or the data's invalidated, blah, blah, blah. And so I said, well, let's start a research company and let's build a poop bank. And so, our first 6 months was basically testing all the different ways that you can collect poop, and, how easy they were, how they were going to affect the sample that was coming to you, because we wanted to be able to ship it through the mail and have it ick-free. And so we actually designed and patented this little hammock called the BioCollector. It was this little white coated paper hammock that you stuck these 2 suction cups on the side of the toilet. You pooped, and then you picked up the whole thing just by the arms and dropped it into a cooler with a ice brick that you froze in your freezer and shipped it off to us. And then we took those, the whole shooting match, and we would homogenize it and make it into these, we kind of joked and called them shitlets, but they were little vials of poop that we made available to scientists all over the world. And then we did sequencing and started to look at all of that. And as a part of that, we were also building a larger Parkinson's stool bank, which has gone on to fuel some published research. We published research with Sarcus Masmanian. Our paper was part of a meta-analysis last year that showed some connections to certain B vitamin deficiency in the microbiome. And I'm about to come out with a paper with Dr. Barry Ninham of Australia, who's a pioneer in looking at the glycocalyx. And we're able to connect basically the Parkinson's poop back to what's going on in the systems of the body. And one of the things we discovered in collecting the whole sample is that the people in our lab could tell if someone had Parkinson's just by looking at their stool.
Wow, tell me more about that. And so what were the findings, or what was that presenting as in a sample?
Well, so a Parkinson's stool. So when we would process the samples, we would homogenize them and then use a large syringe to put them into the little tubes. But with a Parkinson's sample, that was not feasible. Because the sample had the consistency of concrete. So we actually had to use a caulking gun to apply more pressure.
Interesting.
And nothing like that had ever been published. Now, there's quite a bit of data connecting constipation and, let's say, severe constipation preceding a diagnosis of 10 to 15 years. But so that was back in 2016, 2017 that we discovered that. Like, it's taken up to this point with Dr. Ninham, he's arguably the world's most renowned colloid scientist. Well, in soils, like hard-packed soils, same thing with a hard-packed stool, or even with concrete. You know, it's interesting because it went all the way back to my dad was a home builder, and he was teaching me pouring concrete. And to get the concrete to harden in the wintertime, you would add 2% calcium. So this tiny bit of calcium can make something harden. And that's what it's turned out, this electrolyte problem from the battle in the gut. A tiny bit of calcium comes out of the bad bacteria kill the good bacteria. They spill out their potassium and calcium, and that calcium causes a concrete-like colloid mass that is incredibly difficult to pass. I mean, and then it also affects the signal propagation for peristalsis, the potassium spilling. But that really large colloidal mass was what we found, in our samples. We just didn't know the kind of underlying chemistry of what was going on until really in the last year of working with Dr. Ninham.
So interesting. I want to go back just for one moment. It's my understanding there's not a blood test for Parkinson's. Parkinson's is a story that we're saying this person is presenting with these symptoms, and so we're kind of clustering them into your group. As your husband was going through this process, what did you learn about Parkinson's and what it really is?
Well, it was really interesting to me over his 23 years with Parkinson's. Neurologists never take blood work. They never take a blood sample, which is kind of mind-boggling. So we went to, functional medicine doctors and so we found, there are a lot of factors that can contribute. It's a multifactorial disease that John always called it a designer disease because, this person over here may have these 5 symptoms and this person over here has, these 5 symptoms, but maybe only 2 of them overlap. So, and I started kind of mapping the symptoms to different gut bacteria, looking at, okay, if this bacteria, what are the symptoms of an acute infection? And then what might be the symptoms of a low grade chronic infection, and kind of tying those pieces together. But heavy metals is another factor. There's lots and lots of toxicology research over the years of the effects of different metals. And John actually grew up in Cleveland, Ohio in the 60s and 70s when the Cuyahoga River caught on fire. I mean, it was just a cesspool of pollution. And so he was exposed to that through the air, probably through the water as well. And then he worked on a golf course. So I started kind of drawing a map. He was a caddy on a golf course for 4 years in high school and college over the summers. So lots of herbicide and pesticide exposure. He worked at a manometer company one summer, and that's an instrument that uses mercury. So he was exposed to mercury again there. When he got out of college, he went to work in sales out in West Texas and was basically going out to sell on the oil rigs drill bits. And of course, then he's exposed to a lot of hydrocarbons. And then he went on to, he ran a very high-end men's clothing store. So he was dressed in a suit every day. So he was exposed to dry cleaning fluid. So there's actually a new book out by Dr. Ray Dorsey and Michael O'Koon called The Parkinson's Plan. And they go through a number of the toxins that are implicated in Parkinson's. Paraquat is one of those, the TCE from the dry cleaning fluid. You know, there's a whole host of these different compounds. What they don't connect in that book is how these different chemicals actually go into the structures in our body, the glycocalyx, the membranes, and they change how those membranes work and propagate signal. And that's also part of what we're going to be showing in our Parkinson's paper that's coming out. So I started to learn about a lot of the different, I'll say, external factors, but only in the last year, I started working with a nonprofit called Resolve Parkinson's that is run by Parkinson's patients. A lot of the nonprofits, patients are kind of a sideline. And they actually came to me and they said, you know, we've seen a lot of your Parkinson's research. We've seen what you're doing. Like, can you tell us, how do we get a seat at the table? And I said, whose table? Like, none of these people are curing Parkinson's. Set your own table. And so we started talking about how to, you know, set our own table. And as a part of that, we wanted to bring the voices of Parkinson's to life for people. So we started a docuseries, and we've done about 35 interviews. I've written about some of them, but we haven't released the actual interviews yet. But what we found in that process was the overwhelming majority, high 90%, there was some type of traumatic trigger that preceded the diagnosis. So a huge emotional shift or shake. It could be death of a parent, you know, major illness with the child, loss of a job. John had a startup company that he had put everything into, and it was the precursor to text messaging through paging. And they basically got sort of screwed out of it by Motorola, and he lost everything. And that, these kind of earth-shattering changes or events have deep emotional effect on us. And we started to see in our interviews, especially with the men, that they had shoved it down so they didn't have to feel it. And they would start talking to us and the emotion would come up and some of them would cry. And we're like, okay, there's a big piece of this puzzle that no one is talking about, which, is the fear and grief and sadness that really needs to be dealt with because it's trapped in the body. And the issue is in the tissue. My massage and neuromuscular person has talked about that. And I think that's really underappreciated in Parkinson's because they're holding in and holding on so tightly, they just get stiffer and stiffer and stiffer.
Yeah. Man, does that resonate with me? I feel that when there's times in my life when I've not been able to be a provider, I feel the low that is associated with that as a man, that I'm like, I should be able to do this right now. What's the matter with me? And it really does hurt. It's so interesting. I can only assume how that generational programming has probably doubled down over generations. And
Right.
now here we are, Yeah, it's so wild. It's so wild. I want to pivot back to the gut microbiome. And you said, as we were up in Chicago and you're funding these studies to run sample collections from both you and your husband, what did you discover apart? We've had it's pretty high level audience. We understand there's different species and phylum and genus within the microbiome. So what was the discovery?
Well, I would get these spreadsheets, with down the left-hand column, all these names of these bacteria. And we were doing whole genome sequencing. So we had the bacteria, we had the fungi, we had the viruses, we had the parasites. But what I learned from that too is the data that you're getting is only as good as the databases of the information that have been curated.
That's right.
But, and then it would have all the samples across. So I just started, going bug by bug down, looking
Can I
at
ask what year this is?
it was 2015.
Right. Great. So no
So
chat GPT.
no chat GPT. Even at that point, I was just discovering PubMed. And so I would go to PubMed and type in what the bacteria was. And I used Google a lot too. And I would read these papers or, read the abstract. And then I started getting deeper and deeper into the paper. But I'm reading down and I see this virus called Pandora virus. And I was like, what is that? And so I called my bioinformatics person who was at the University of Chicago. And I said, what is this Pandora virus? And he, tells me a little bit and says, here's the scientist who discovered it. His name is Jean-Michel Claverie. And so I started looking at his research, and he had discovered it in two places. One was in Chile and the other was in Australia. That was about 25 kilometers from a place John and I had stayed in 2009 when we went to meet a naturopath and a homeopath in Australia about some of their Parkinson's work. And when we got back from Australia, John had been very, very sick. He lost 15 pounds. It sent us on this crazy, 4 months of doing all this testing and scans. They found a spot on his kidney and enlarged spleen. And they did blood cultures. They couldn't find anything. And they ultimately said, well, we're going to do a bone marrow biopsy. So while we're waiting for the results of the bone marrow biopsy, we're going to put you on this really powerful antibiotic. And so they put him on Levaquin for 6 weeks, and it all cleared up. And we had just said, okay, well, it's, cured. But like this Mimi virus, I think actually came from that trip, and its natural host is an amoeba. So, back to the parasite. And so I communicated with the French scientist a bit, and he went back over to Australia and did some samples, but it never went very far. But I did start digging later on into these. They're called giant viruses, and they use them sometimes in genetic engineering as what's called a chassis, where they can add different genes from different organisms to it. So it's a little bit creepy, actually.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It sounds like we're into like a Warner Brothers summer
Yeah.
blockbuster movie.
Yeah. And when you give it a name like Pandora, you're like, why'd you give it that name?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Mildly nefarious. And so the patterns that you started to see and learn about both your and your husband's stool samples, like what was the big takeaway, or some of your published work that you said, you guys, everybody should really be looking at this?
So, I mean, like early on, I was still kind of learning what are the differences in these different organisms. And what really helped me the most is in 2017, I brought on Dr. Raul Cano, who had been a professor of microbial ecology at Cal Poly for about 35 years. And I mean, he's just a world-renowned scientist in microbiology. He was part of the team that sequenced the first lactobacillus. He had an undergraduate work in mycology, so he understood fungi. He'd written textbooks on. So he started to teach me about the different bacteria and gram negative and gram positive. And so then I was able to kind of categorize better and understand better. And I did start to see that John had more of the gram negative bacteria. And you say there's no blood test for Parkinson's. There is no agreed upon blood test for Parkinson's. But I would say, after all these years of looking at this, that a good test of a marker would be serum endotoxin. And the reason I say that is these gram negative bacteria, their cell wall produces this lipopolysaccharide endotoxin that is highly inflammatory. And we have brain inflammation. And so then I ended up kind of stumbling across a Parkinson's researcher who was proposing that endotoxin is actually one of the primary causes of Parkinson's. And so then I started looking, and if you go to PubMed, there's 500 papers using endotoxin in animal models to drive Parkinson's-like symptoms. Well, okay. And so then from that, I started kind of connecting the dots across all these chronic diseases, which was, our goal originally, once we started the poop bank, was let's see what's in common across these. And endotoxin, if you just go to PubMed and type just about any chronic problem and endotoxin, and you will see animal models or the cellular models of inflammation use endotoxin. And so that to me was like, okay, what are we going to do about these endotoxin producers and kind of bringing those down? And then I saw at a very low level mycobacteria, which of course in the United States, people are like, nobody's got mycobacteria. But that actually led me. So in I think it was 2018, there was a paper published that showed that there's a gene in Parkinson's called LRRK2, which they spent a decade just looking at that because Sergey Brin's mother has that genetic mutation. She has Parkinson's. But it showed that gene mutation was a negative regulator of tuberculosis. So I ended up down this deep rabbit hole of looking at mycobacteria tuberculosis and then digging deeper into the Parkinson samples, not finding tuberculosis, but finding other species of mycobacteria. And through that, actually met Dr. Tom Dow, who does a lot of autoimmune research after retiring as an eye surgeon. And his work is in what's going on in the milk supply. The cows, it's endemic in the milk supply, is something called Mycobacterium avium paratuberculosis. And it's connected to Crohn's and a lot of these kind of inflammatory illnesses. And nobody's really talking about it or looking at it. And so I sent samples to a bunch of different places looking specifically at mycobacteria, and my husband's sample had the highest amount of mycobacteria reads from this one specialized work we did. It was not, it was not either the paratuberculosis or the tuberculosis, but it was a mycobacteria. But then I got connected to another researcher at the University of Georgia who had developed a new assay for looking for latent tuberculosis in people. And he did that while he was at the CDC, but they never released it. So we actually sent blood samples of John's to him, and he ran that test 3 times in triplicate each time, so 9 tests. And all 3 of those were positive for latent tuberculosis. Well, if you look, Parkinson's over time becomes what I would say is a chronic wasting, which is also what tuberculosis is. But like getting a clinical practitioner to agree with, all of these different pieces of the puzzle is practically impossible. It is practically impossible. And, I would say also in the fecal samples we did for different people, we produced a 60-page report. People would try to take it to their doctor. The doctor would cross his eyes and say, I don't know what you're talking about. Sometimes sometimes they would call and talk to me, but I had one of John's friends with Parkinson's, and I sat down with her and her brother who had a biology background and was showing that she had actually the highest level of proteobacteria I had seen in any of our samples. Like, I want to say 12 or 15% of her whole sample was proteobacteria. And that's a problem. And I tried, because I knew her neurologist, I tried to help her get a referral to an infectious disease neurologist, and he wouldn't see her. I mean, it's kind of wacky.
Yeah. Well, you're, obviously, like, what you're doing as you're a caretaker for your husband and an advocate for his health. You are very much, especially the timeline we're talking about, 2012, 2014, 2017. You're pioneering this. And it's like you're saying, you walk into an office and you make this discovery as a patient. I'm not a doctor. And you advocate for this thing. You're like, there's something here. And, like, to your point, your doctor kind of looks at you cross-eyed and be like, no, that's not scientific, or it's not real, or I don't care, I'm too overwhelmed. And so you really have to go out and do a lot of this stuff, or you definitely did. I mean, it's different today in 2025. I mean,
It
the
is.
reports that you can get off of a stool diagnostic are incredible compared to, like, 2007 when I was first doing this. I mean, not only is everything broken down into different categories, but now we have better collection banks. We have a better understanding about these imbalances and what the downstream effects or impacts could be.
And some of the tools can tell you what an organism is resistant to or not resistant to. And
That's
that's
right.
another. I had a friend who had an autoimmune issue, who was part of our sample bank, and she actually was in the hospital and in the intensive care unit where they said she probably wasn't going to make it. And I was in her room and I looked on the wall of the antibiotics that they were giving her. And I was like, wait a minute, I have all this antibiotic resistance data in her fecal sample. And I went home and got my computer, came back and told the doctor, I was like, she's resistant to every antibiotic you're giving her. You need to give her this. And 3 hours later, she was fine.
Wow. Yeah.
But I
Incredible.
mean, you have to get somebody who will listen to you.
You have to find somebody that will listen
And
to you.
who's this, crazy, the crazy poop lady.
I wanna go further into things that we can do to help rebalance these things in the gut. But before we do, I'd just love to know, again, I'm just really I've been on a very similar journey. You go to 100 doctors and you're like, okay, I guess I'm doing this on my own. And what was that, what was that like for you guys, to be in this seeker mentality and to stay the eye on the prize, right? To stay focused. And I know you're probably met every 6 months with like, oh, you guys have to try this, or it's this, or you got to talk to this person. Like the promise that like the next practitioner or therapy is going to bring resolve.
Well, what I will say is we did see in different things that we tried, not from a practitioner mostly from, me studying and digging in. An occasional practitioner, we found a great naturopath that helped with heavy metals detox and um, looking at the genetics and supplements. But, for the most part, like at the very beginning, I started looking at food, and John had been drinking this soy protein shake from some multi-level marketing thing that he was getting from our neighbor, and every day for 2 years. And I kind of went down the soy rabbit hole, and he was drinking soy milk and so, all, and I was like, no more soy. So we got rid of all of that, and we got rid of as much as possible the processed food. I was traveling a lot for my job, so sometimes he would go back to, spaghetti and a jar of tomato sauce. But we saw pretty immediately a change in, like, he had a tremor in his tongue and a tremor in his pinky. And when we changed the diet, both of those disappeared. The visual ability to see it. Now you could still feel, he called it an internal, it's like a shiver. Like you can touch them and you can feel a vibration, but it's not visible. But we saw the visible stuff go away. Then, he found, we went to the Cleveland Clinic and we learned about the work of Dr. Jay Alberts, who had been basically demonstrating that stationary bike cycling at or what they called forced exercise at 70 to 80 RPMs, or maybe it was 80 to 90 RPMs, for an hour 3 times a week could reverse the symptoms of Parkinson's by 35%. And so that improved him significantly. So we would see these different things that were we tried the cycling, and then we told his neurologist and he kind of rolled his eyes. Well, now all the neurologists, all these years later, recommend the exercise in those programs. But, they just, there wasn't enough scientific evidence around that. But then, in looking at the microbiome, I was like, okay, well, how are we going to fix this? And I really hadn't, it was still pretty early in my process of trying to understand the microbiome. And I went to the World Parkinson's Congress with John in the fall of 2016. And so our youngest son had gone off to college. John had been the stay-at-home dad while I traveled and worked. And so that kind of, back to the emotional loss of, last kid leaves the home, what's my job now? Who am I? He was having a little more trouble then walking. So he was freezing more. He was walking with a walking stick. And at that conference, they showed some research from a scientist in Israel that the sugar alcohol mannitol could stop the aggregation of the proteins in an animal model and actually pull them out of the brain and clear them. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting. So I came back and I bought this little mannitol chemistry book and started looking at mannitol. I'm like, this is really an amazing molecule because it's used a lot of ways in medicine. But the first chapter of the book had a discussion of bacteria that ferment mannitol out of glucose and fructose. And of course, what do we have too much of in the Western diet? Glucose and fructose. I also knew my husband was a sugar addict, and pretty much every Parkinson's person I met, or most of them, are sugar addicts. And I'm like, okay, how can we make a little factory of microbes and put them back in the gut to convert this glucose and fructose into mannitol so that we have a working system? And I had a friend who was a fermentation chemist and had spent 20 years in the probiotics industry. And we sat down and looked at how can we put together a team that will work together to do this. And he helped me quickly prototype and get 100 bottles made by a contract manufacturer that he knew. And most of the time you couldn't get anybody to make you just 100 bottles, but we did. And John started taking it, and we were measuring his microbiome, and it's moving back closer and closer and closer to a healthy human microbiome. And he stopped walking with the cane, and he stopped freezing. And so we're like, okay, there's something to this. And we just started like giving out samples to people, not with Parkinson's. And they were like, this stuff is great. It's more regular. I've got better energy. I'm like, how can it, do all these things? And, we just kind of put it on our website as a sideline if people wanted to buy it. And we started making, but we weren't really, going to be a probiotics company. But with Raul and all his knowledge of all these different microbes, I said, well, we've made this working system. Like, can we make working systems to put back these other functions that people have lost? And so Raul and I kind of locked ourselves into the whiteboard room at the lab for a couple of weeks. And we just started mapping out, what are these issues? Because when you start looking into microbes, they make everything. They can break everything down. I mean, they are amazing. And they are the workhorses of even like pharmaceuticals. They make these molecules in fermentation. So, we just started mapping out, okay, if we wanted to support the immune system, or we wanted microbes to make like CoQ10 and help support nitric oxide for cardiovascular health, or, what about when people take antibiotics? How can we put together a team that's going to, foster that? Or, people who are stressed, or, can we make one that makes B vitamins, or, yeah. So we mapped out like 25 different things, and, we still kind of set it to the side. And we had built a computational model that takes the genomes of the strains of those bacteria. And in the genome, that tells you what they're able to make or break down. It's kind of the toolkit that they come into the factory with. And so we started just kind of taking the models the group of organisms that we had built, putting them in the model with their genomes, and seeing how they would interact, and are they going to produce what we want them to produce. And so we still kind of had that over here on the sideline, because we were working on a giant poop slurry for a reference material from a grant we got from the NIH. And so we kind of worked through that into late 2019, and then COVID hit, and we're collecting, poop samples with all the live organisms in them. And we were like, this is probably not a great idea. And so we finished the grant. We decided to stop collecting samples, and we said, okay, let's go back over here and look at the probiotics. And so we pivoted in 2020 and started kind of working on our concepts around, okay, we have these solutions, let's bring the solutions to market. And so that's how BiotiQuest came to be. But, back to my husband and his, so we saw his microbiome improving, but he also improved something called the UPDR score, which is it's a subjective score that a doctor does. And the higher the number, the worse off you are. Well, before he started taking the probiotic, he was at 35. And within a year, he was down to a 20, stabilized there for 4 years until he had COVID. And then COVID, I'd spent all these years looking at Parkinson's, and COVID is just a wrecking ball. And, I was then, several more years down the path of trying to connect how is COVID causing additional damage that kind of overlays on top of all the kind of pieces that I already knew in Parkinson's. And then John had a pulmonary embolism in September of 2024 and passed away. But it was all, it was all connected. But, I didn't know enough then to really understand, and nobody really did. Now there are a lot of doctors who are treating long COVID and starting to have some success with it, but it's a tough challenge to rebuild the membranes of the body that are and the microvasculature that is damaged by COVID.
Yeah, it's a real. I had just had Dr. Evan Hirsch on, and that's primarily what he does. But he's like, there's so many great therapies, and we have to address this exosome, this in total entire environmental burden, be it the metals, the chemicals, the viral overload. He's like, you got to look at it all. You can't just do one thing.
Well, one of the things I learned from Dr. Ninham really in the last year since John passed away, but was the dangers of cleaning products. So quaternary ammonium compounds that are in they're surfactants that are in all the liquid soaps, everything that says antibacterial, all these sprays, things actually we were using at the lab too. But things that we were overloaded with during COVID. And my husband was an obsessive, hand sanitizer, wiping with Clorox wipes, all of that. Those compounds incorporate into the membrane structures and the glycocalyx, and they are immunosuppressant.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I think back now on how much of that, if I had known that,
look at the world. The world
know,
was dousing you with hand sanitizer. I mean, literally, I had people pump it. I'm like, I don't want that.
I know.
It was
And
wild. What a wild
I
time.
mean, you get on the airplane, they're still handing you the wipe, and I'm like, ooh, I don't want
Crazy,
to breathe that stuff
crazy.
in. And so Dr. Ninham actually showed in 1985. He went to Procter and Gamble and showed them that it was immunosuppressant, and they escorted him to the airport and said, "Be careful in your travels; accidents do happen." And they went on about their way, making more and more and more products.
Yeah. Talk to me a little bit more about your findings of some of these chemicals finding their way into the matrix of the membrane and changing its efficacy or how it functions. That's really interesting. I haven't heard that before. And let me ask you this, are there timelines to these things? Is this forever changing the cellular makeup of the membrane? We have a turnover, right? Like I am Freddie today is not the Freddie that was a year ago. Hopefully my net commitment to dry brushing and sauna and full body lymphatic drainage and all the things, hopefully I'm a little bit, the expression, the genetic expression is, I hope it's better all the time.
Well, that's one of the discussions I've been having with Dr. Ninham, because, different chemicals and things that we've gone back and forth on, he'll say it irreversibly changes the curvature. So a lot of his work is around curvature, the mathematics of curvature. And, the curvature, the structure is what drives the function. And so if you permanently change or you stiffen these membranes, they can't, they can't change and do what they need to do. Because the glycocalyx is what's called a bicontinuous structure, and it is constantly changing based on what it's exposed to, whether that's electromagnetic fields, whether that is compounds that we are eating or being exposed to, what we're breathing in. And so when you do something that either damages that structure, so when it's in a cubic phase, it forms these tubes that are kind of sorting what comes in and out. And if you damage those tubes, then things can't get in and out. Or if you change the structure and the tube gets too small, then some things that need to get in can't get in or out. So it can have a lot of effects, but what he found was that the quaternary ammonium compounds, the surfactants, had about a 9-month life. Okay, so great, 9 months from now it could be out of my body, except for you're exposed to it every single day. So if you're exposed to these soaps, detergents, shampoos, it's in some toothpaste. You've really got to be vigilant in order to protect those structures. And until we start to understand that, and we're also starting to look at, I think bacteria also have a glycocalyx. And these things may also be affecting antibiotic resistance and the recognition of structures there. So, but my question to him is, how can it be irreversible if, we break down and recycle our body, and, different cell types have a different life. But I think one of the drivers there is, let's say you break down a cell that has some of these chemicals incorporated into the membrane. If you don't have a process for removing them as they're broken down, they will get recycled and,
Yes.
send their signals down the line, to the next cell.
Yeah.
And so
I
that,
mean,
like hexane is one of those that they were talking about. And, hexane is used to process a lot of the oils. And so, like, making sure, anything you're coming in contact with is hexane free, definitely do that, because you don't want to, like, that one's a tough one to get rid of.
yeah, it's really interesting. I'm listening to this. First of all, Martha, I have to have you back on.
Okay.
I have to have you back on.
Well, you can
There's
have me
so
back
much
after I publish the paper, because we'll have a lot to talk about there.
there's so much overlap in like the work you're doing, and then you have this very near and dear to my heart is the community struggling with chronic illness in the world of we can say biotoxin illness. So that could be Lyme and Lyme's co-infections, or it could be mold. There's a lot of overlap in the conversations, and I'm hearing, oh, that ties in there, that ties in there. But what's fascinating to me, a lot of times the camps don't talk to each other. So you have these people doing this incredible amount of work, and I'm like, Dr. So-and-so needs to hear this like right now, and that's I love the innovation that happens in our space, but then there's like this capitalism. It's like driving, you're going to do this work and you're going to skyrocket out here with this entity, and then this person's going to do this, but there's no intercommunication. I'm hoping that's what, as much as I loathe social media and AI taking over, I'm hoping that there will be a broader sharing network that happens as a result of this communication that happens instantly.
Well, so it's interesting you say that, because like the neurological disease, they're all separate too. But I had somebody tell me, Martha, you need to go to this ALS conference. And, she just was, you've got to go, you've got to go. It's patient led. They have all these practitioners. It's called Healing ALS. And so I was like, okay, I'll sign up for it. And so I went actually a week and a half ago, and it was
Where was it?
It was in Las Vegas. It was 4 days. And it was just incredible. So they have about 60 patients that they've reversed their ALS symptoms. And I met one of them who's a personal trainer who
I want to go to this next year.
It's incredible, because they cover everything. And I'll email, or I'll send you an email. They have this diagram that sort of starts in the center and then goes out, and it has, the toxic load. It has the mental mindset. It has nutrition and what's, and the gut and the inability to uptake nutrients and what's going on in the microbiome that's affecting that. And then they do a lot of energy work and spiritual work and, purpose. They talked about, how important having purpose is. And so it was the, most holistic conference I'd ever been to. and just lots of incredible information, but a framework, because I was talking to them, I was like, we need to like bring the Parkinson's people into this, maybe have it together, or at least use this structure and framework to have a similar conversation with Parkinson's. But the one thing I would say that makes, with ALS, people have a more urgent sense of needing to do something, because there's nothing that they have that makes their symptoms better. It's a much faster moving issue. And so they're more highly motivated to look at and try things, where Parkinson's, they have, oh, we can mask this symptom and we can mask this. So, and it moves a lot slower. So it kind of divides up, I would say, and John used to say it's the 80-20 rule. The 80% who are just going to stick with that conventional, the diagnosis they've got, they're not looking for other answers. And then there's this 20%, and it's usually the younger people who want to change the trajectory and do something. But the fact that there's a drug that can mask the symptoms makes them have less of a sense of urgency.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, there's so much work to do. I would love that email. I would love that infographic just to see. I have something very similar in the course, the academy that I teach in. And I know how it all interrelates, and I know how important it is. Let me ask you this, if only because we're coming to the end of our hour. We mentioned, we just touched on a couple times BioQuest. Biotic Quest.
I know, we picked a name that's hard for people to say. Biotic Life Quest. Biotic Quest.
And so tell me, if I just want to, if I were somebody to come into the website and I just want to do something to, upregulate and improve my gut, I'm constantly in a state of overwhelm. Not only myself, but like every week there's a new, I sat through a lecture at, sat through a lecture at A4M last year, and I listened to Peter Attia talk about, Pendulum is the only probiotic that's ever going to shift the gut, that we all need this one Acromantia that is literally priced at like $100 a bottle. It's very expensive, and it's one strain, it's one pill. I don't see anything. Again, I not to knock Peter or the product, but I look at this and I'm like, well, it's a single strain, and is this a marketing spin? So I'm always very cautious, Now I of this space, right? Because you get a big budget behind a product and you can skyrocket it to the masses, just like Athletic Greens. I mean, I think it's fine. Iterations have changed over time, but I'm always very cautious in the space. So how do we navigate this, and tell us a little bit about Biotic Quest?
Okay, well, first I'll just say one thing about Akkermansia. It's a very interesting organism, but it's a double-edged sword. So it's highly elevated in Parkinson's and multiple sclerosis. I have a LinkedIn post a week or so ago where I talk a little bit about discussions I had with Stephanie Seneff about Akkermansia and hydrogen sulfide and kind of what all's going on in the gut. So I do caution anybody that has Parkinson's or MS or a neurological problem to be very, very careful and not take that product. But, two things we have 6 products, but the 2 products I typically recommend if people are, you said overwhelmed. So our newest product is called Perfect Peace. And it's a product that the microbial system that we put together helps support the calming neurotransmitter GABA production. So, and we actually have, I think it's on our Instagram, you can see about 20 minutes after taking it, on the Whoop, you can see the stress score just drop. And so I think, for a just general, like taking the edge off of this crazy world and being able to sit back into your own presence, that perfect peace is the perfect thing. And I take it when I'm about to have a stressful day, or, if I kind of feel the tension mounting, I can just
Hmm.
20 minutes later, I feel the edge come off. And so that's a great product. But the Sugar Shift product, you're not going to feel it instantly like Perfect Peace, but that's the product I made for John that cleans up those proteins. We did a clinical trial in diabetes with that product, and it moved all the diabetes markers, but we measured serum endotoxin. And at 3 months, it significantly reduced serum endotoxin. And then we unblinded at the end of it and kept another group on for an additional 90 days. And so at the end of that 180-day period, almost all of the endotoxin was gone. And what
Mm.
we saw in the change in the microbiome was it moved back to an anaerobic gut, which is what your gut is supposed to be. So it got rid of the facultative aerobic bacteria that can use the oxygen, and it fostered, the coming back and the increase of bifidobacteria, Faecali prosnetia, and Roseburia that aren't even in the formula. So it's,
Hmm.
it's helping the whole ecosystem come back. But that's a product you kind of need to marry yourself to for a bit, 3, 6, 9 months, a year, to reshape your gut and get it back in shape.
Yeah. Yeah. Really, really, really good information. I just want to echo what you're saying is that like, it's not when we have a deficiency of just bifido, it doesn't mean we need to dump bifido in the body. A lot of times it's thinking of this as a community, and it's like, what are the players that we're going to put into this microbiome to send everything back into a more homeostatic balance? I really like, just peeking at some of the formulas here, we've got different amino acids in some of these supplements here.
Yeah.
We've got cofactors like inulin, so we've got like a chicory root as a prebiotic. And this is another piece. A lot of times we take these supplements and we do not have, it's like you're putting kindling wood. There's no fuel on the fire to grow these things, whether that's from a dietary constraint, but it's also timing around the probiotic, is from my understanding, when the prebiotic is ready to help these things grow and expand.
Right. So, and that's, our whole thinking around how we put these formulas together was from an ecosystems approach. These things don't work in isolation, they work as
That's
teams.
right.
So if you put
Yeah.
a team together that supports the function you're trying to put in, then you're going to get a better result. And so that's why, like, we get real results because we've designed a team, and we really are the only people that design teams like this.
Yeah. Amazing. I cannot wait to try. If you told me to try one thing, I'm kind of geared toward, I'll tell you what my intuition says.
Okay.
My intuition says, I'm just trying to get this up here. Hold on, I gotta move the screen. My intuition says I want to try the total gut reset.
That actually, the total gut reset, especially, with a history of Lyme, so you've had plenty of antibiotics, that
Three
it,
years solid.
you know, so it has the antibiotic antidote, which was designed specifically to, set up a pH and an environment that fosters kind of the whole suite of bacteria so that you can restore after antibiotics. And then it has our ideal immunity, which is I'll say it's pretty targeted to pathogenic bacteria, especially from food poisoning, or so salmonella, listeria, E. coli. So that's a lot of those endotoxin producers too. And then it moves you into the sugar shift that is kind of overall metabolic health, and it has the suite of, it's making different glycans that can support the glycocalyx, and all the signaling and energy production. And so it's a stepped process for that, and we actually just introduced that a few months ago, because a lot of people have been exposed to a ton of antibiotics, and they're not really sure, how do I go through this process. And that antibiotic antidote, um, we had formulated that, but not brought it to market. And Steve, my advisor who originally helped me with the sugar shift formula, he came to me because his mother in her 80s had appendicitis and had her appendix removed, got septic, was on IV antibiotics for a month and a half, and then her gut was a mess. And the doctor's like, "Oh, that's just the way it is. There's nothing you can do." And he said, "Don't you have that antibiotic formula?" And so we made a little batch so that she could have it. And she became this super fan, and Steve just was scratching his head. He said, "I've been telling my mom about probiotics for 25 years." And so
Yeah.
finally she takes your product and she's like, "Wow, this stuff is incredible." So it was
Yeah.
kind of funny. Yeah.
Yeah. When the time is right, people will pick up the torch and run with it, but not
Right.
until it's right. Not
You're
until it's
exactly
right.
right. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's been such a treat to have you on. Um, I am going to, again, I'd love to have you on again in the future. I really appreciate the work you're doing, and I appreciate the work that your husband did in
Yes. In
helping bring all
fact,
this forward.
I have a tribute to him in the paper because, I mean, he used to joke and say he was lab rat number one because he tried the no fun diet 1 through 20. Um, but, he was really a huge contributor to understanding the mechanisms and the science. And I know we're at the end, but one of the things that he actually kind of drove home for me, I said, "Well, what does it feel like when your legs don't work?" And he said, "Well, it feels like back when I was running marathons and I'm overloaded with lactic acid." And that was a whole nother metabolic clue for us that lactic acidosis is part of what's going on here. So I he comes to me still with inspiration, and he's the driving force behind what led me down this path. And um, I carry that love forward and trying to help more people.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Thank you for your time this morning, Martha. It was truly like a beautifully broken story, and I can't wait to put this one out.
Thanks so much for having me.